The anonymous feedback system had become a lightning rod, sparking both hope and resentment. Each morning, Amira would arrive to a fresh set of submissions. Some were constructive, highlighting areas where processes could improve. Others were more damning, exposing behaviors and attitudes that had been swept under the rug for years. Time and again, Daniel's name appeared, linked to incidents of unprofessional conduct, discriminatory remarks, and a general lack of respect for both colleagues and customers. Amira knew she couldn't ignore the reports, but she also knew that acting too quickly could backfire. She needed a plan, something that would not only address Daniel's behavior, but also send a clear message to the rest of the team. Until then, she observed quietly, gathering evidence and letting the weight of his actions catch up with him. Daniel, however, was far from passive. As the walls closed in, he became more determined to fight back. In quiet moments, he reached out to those who shared his frustration, subtly sowing seeds of doubt about Amira's leadership. This isn't about improvement, he would say. It's about control. She's turning this place into her personal experiment, and we're the guinea pigs. But not everyone was swayed by his words. Sophie, once one of Daniel's closest allies, had grown distant. The training sessions and feedback discussions had opened her eyes to things she hadn't wanted to see. She began to question not just Daniel's behavior, but her own role in enabling it. Every time she passed Amira in the hallway, Sophie felt a pang of guilt, wondering if she should say something, do something, to make amends. One day, Sophie found herself lingering near Amira's office, her heart pounding as she debated whether to knock. Before she could make up her mind, a door opened, and Amira stepped out, catching Sophie by surprise. "Sophie," Amira said warmly, though her eyes betrayed a hint of curiosity. "Is there something you need?" Sophie hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Actually, yes. Do you have a moment?" Amira nodded and ushered her inside. As they sat down, Sophie fidgeted with her hands, struggling to find the right words. I wanted to thank you," she began. "For everything you're doing here. I know it hasn't been easy." Amira smiled faintly. "Change rarely is, but I appreciate your support. It means a lot." Sophie hesitated again, then added, "I'd also wanted to apologize. I've seen things, heard things that I should have spoken up about sooner. Especially when it comes to Daniel." Amira leaned forward slightly, her expression serious but not unkind. "It's never too late to do the right thing, Sophie. If there's something you want to share, I'm here to listen." And so Sophie began to talk, her words spilling out in a rush as she recounted incidents she had witnessed over the years. By the time she finished, Amira's expression was thoughtful, her mind already working to piece together the bigger picture. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "This helps more than you know." As Sophie left the office, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders, though a new sense of unease crept in. She knew that speaking out might have consequences, especially if Daniel found out. But for the first time, she felt like she was on the right side of things. Meanwhile, Daniel's frustrations reached a boiling point. One evening, as he reviewed his dwindling list of allies, he decided to confront Amira directly. He had spent weeks feeling cornered, his authority undermined at every turn. If he didn't act now, he feared he might lose everything. The next morning, Daniel waited until the office was quiet before approaching Amira's door. Without knocking, he stepped inside, his expression tight with barely contained anger. Amira looked up from her desk, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his agitation. "Mr. Hargrove," she said evenly. "To what do I owe this visit?" Daniel didn't sit. He loomed over her desk, his voice low but tense. "I think we need to have a serious conversation about what's happening here." Amira set down her pen and folded her hands, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I agree. Please have a seat." "I'll stand," Daniel snapped. "Look, I get it. You're here to shake things up, make your mark. But you're going too far. This place ran just fine before you got here." Amira raised an eyebrow, her calm unwavering. "Did it? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like there were a lot of problems being ignored." Daniel's jaw tightened. What happened to professionalism, to respect? You've turned this place into a witch hunt. Amira leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Is that what you think this is? A witch hunt? What else would you call it? Daniel shot back. Every policy, every meeting, every training, it's all aimed at people like me. Amira's eyes narrowed slightly, her voice firm. People like you? And who, exactly, do you think I'm targeting, Mr. Hargrove? Daniel faltered, realizing too late that he had walked into a trap. He tried to recover, his tone defensive. I'm just saying, you're creating division. People are scared to speak their minds because they don't want to end up on your bad side. Amira stood, her presence suddenly imposing despite her calm tone. Mr. Hargrove, let me be very clear. I'm not here to create division. I'm here to fix what was broken. If that makes some people uncomfortable, so be it. But this isn't about you or me or anyone else individually. It's about creating a workplace where everyone feels respected and valued. If you have a problem with that, then perhaps you should take a hard look at why. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, Daniel said nothing, his anger giving way to a flicker of doubt. Without another word, he turned and left, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Amira sat back down, her heart steady despite the confrontation. She knew that the tension was reaching its peak, that the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. But she also knew she was ready, no matter what came next. The air in the bank had shifted, and while many employees seemed to be adapting to the changes, a quiet undercurrent of unease persisted. Amira knew that systemic change didn't happen overnight. It required patience, persistence, and a willingness to confront resistance head-on. But even she couldn't have anticipated what came next. The morning after her confrontation with Daniel, Amira arrived to find an email flagged as urgent sitting in her inbox. It was from an anonymous whistleblower claiming to have uncovered something deeply troubling about the bank's operations. As she read through the message, her brow furrowed. The allegations weren't just about bias or misconduct. It suggested a larger issue, one that could shake the foundation of the entire institution. The whistleblower detailed suspicious account activities that seemed to target specific customers. Certain accounts, many belonging to minority clients, were flagged repeatedly for irregularities without valid justification. The pattern was alarming and pointed to a deliberate effort to deny access to funds or create hurdles for these individuals. At the center of many of these cases was Daniel Hargrove. The accusations suggested that Daniel had not only perpetuated biased behavior, but might have been actively involved in targeting customers under the guise of protocol. Amira leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. If the claims were true, this wasn't just about one employee's attitude. It was a systemic issue that could implicate the bank at a high level. But before she acted, she needed proof. She reached out to the bank's compliance officer, sharing the anonymous email and requesting a discreet investigation. They agreed, their tone indicating both concern and determination. Amira's trust in the process was cautious but resolute. Meanwhile, Daniel remained oblivious to the storm brewing around him. His confidence had been shaken after his tense exchange with Amira, but his sense of entitlement persisted. He viewed the bank as his territory, a place where he had long wielded influence without consequence. However, cracks were beginning to form in his carefully maintained facade. One afternoon, as Daniel was going about his usual routine, Sophie approached him with an unusual request. Daniel, she said, her voice tight. Could we talk for a minute? Privately. Daniel, intrigued but wary, gestured toward an empty office. Once inside, Sophie hesitated before speaking. I need to know something, she began, her eyes searching his face. About the flagged accounts. Are you doing anything you shouldn't be? Daniel's expression hardened instantly, and he crossed his arms defensively. What are you implying, Sophie? That I'm doing something unethical? I don't know, Sophie admitted, her voice trembling slightly. But people are starting to notice a pattern. If there's anything going on, you need to stop before it gets worse. Daniel scoffed, his tone dismissive. This is ridiculous. You're letting Amira's little crusade get to your head. There's no pattern, just protocols. But Sophie didn't look convinced. As she left the office, Daniel felt a flicker of doubt, though he quickly brushed it aside. He couldn't afford to show weakness now, not when he felt like he was under constant scrutiny. As the compliance team quietly began their investigation, more anomalies came to light. Amira worked closely with them, providing context and guidance without tipping off the rest of the staff. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that the issue wasn't isolated to Daniel. There were systemic flaws in the bank's protocols that allowed biased actions to go unchecked. But Daniel's involvement stood out, not just because of his behavior, but because of the deliberate nature of his actions. Just when Amira thought things couldn't get more complicated, another twist emerged. The whistleblower reached out again, this time providing a critical piece of evidence: internal emails from Daniel's account. The messages revealed a shocking level of malice, with Daniel mocking certain customers and bragging about how he could make their lives harder without repercussions. The language was damning, and the implications were even worse. Amira sat in her office, staring at the evidence in disbelief. She felt a mix of anger and resolve. This wasn't just about one man's prejudice. It was about dismantling a culture that allowed such behavior to thrive. But she knew that exposing Daniel wouldn't be enough. She needed to ensure the changes she was implementing would last, long after he was gone. With the compliance team's findings nearly complete, Amira prepared for what would undoubtedly be a turning point. She scheduled a meeting with the bank's senior leadership, presenting her case and demanding immediate action. The stakes were high, and the fallout would be significant. But Amira was ready to face whatever came next. As the days passed, the tension in the bank grew. Whispers of an impending shake-up spread among the staff, though no one knew exactly what was coming. Daniel, still unaware of the full extent of the investigation, began to sense that his position was becoming increasingly precarious. His usual bravado was starting to crack, and he found himself second-guessing every move. And then, just as the pressure seemed unbearable, Amira made an unexpected decision. Instead of calling Daniel into her office, she announced an all-hands meeting for the following morning. The staff buzzed with speculation, unsure of what to expect. Some hoped for clarity, others feared the worst. As the meeting loomed, Daniel's anxiety reached its peak. For the first time, he felt truly out of control, his carefully constructed image slipping through his fingers. Little did he know, the revelations that awaited would be far beyond anything he could have imagined. The stage was set, the stakes higher than ever, and Amira was ready to take the next step toward justice. The morning of the all-hands meeting arrived, and the bank's atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Employees filed into the conference room, their conversations hushed, eyes darting nervously toward one another. At the head of the table, Amira stood poised, her expression calm but commanding. She had carefully planned every word she was about to say, knowing the weight they carried. Daniel entered the room last, his usual air of confidence noticeably absent. He avoided making eye contact with Amira and took a seat near the back, his posture tense. Whispers followed him, the murmurs of suspicion growing louder in his mind. He tried to suppress the gnawing unease, but found it impossible to shake. Amira began the meeting by addressing the group with a steady voice. Over the past few weeks, I've been working closely with many of you to identify ways we can improve not just as a branch, but as a company. I've received invaluable feedback and insight, and I want to thank those of you who have contributed to this process. Her eyes swept across the room, her words hanging in the air. But, she continued, her tone sharpening, this process has also uncovered troubling issues that cannot be ignored. Issues that go beyond simple mistakes or misunderstandings. These are systemic problems rooted in behavior that undermines our values and the trust our customers place in us. A ripple of tension coursed through the room. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his palms beginning to sweat. Amira's gaze finally landed on him, and for the briefest moment their eyes met. The weight of her stare was enough to make him look away. Through our investigation, Amira went on, we've discovered clear evidence of misconduct that has not only violated company policy, but also harmed our clients and jeopardized the integrity of this branch. This misconduct is unacceptable and will be addressed immediately. She turned to the compliance officer, who stepped forward with a folder of documents. We've reviewed internal communications, account logs, and employee feedback, they said, their voice firm. The findings are clear. Discriminatory practices were employed to target specific customers, and policies were misused to deny rightful access to funds. This behavior was deliberate, malicious, and in direct violation of our code of ethics. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward Daniel, who sat frozen in his chair. His face was pale, his confidence shattered. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words. The silence felt deafening, broken only by the quiet rustle of papers as the compliance officer continued to present the evidence. Finally, Amira addressed Daniel directly. "Mr. Hargrove, you have been identified as the primary perpetrator of these actions. Your conduct has not only hurt our customers, but has also damaged the reputation of this institution. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated." Gasps filled the room. Daniel's mouth fell open, his face a mix of shock and indignation. "You can't do this," he stammered, rising from his chair. "This is a setup, a witch hunt. I've done nothing wrong." Amira remained composed, her voice steady. "The evidence speaks for itself. You've had every opportunity to correct your behavior, yet you chose to ignore those chances. Your actions leave us no choice." Daniel's protests grew louder, but they were drowned out by the murmurs of the staff, many of whom nodded in agreement with Amira's decision. 2 security officers entered the room, standing silently by the door. Realizing he had no support, Daniel's defiance crumbled, and he allowed himself to be escorted out, his head hanging low. As the door closed behind him, Amira turned back to the group. "This is not just about one person," she said. "This is about accountability. It's about ensuring that every member of our team upholds the values we stand for. Today marks a turning point, not just for this branch, but for all of us." The room erupted in quiet applause, the tension finally breaking. Amira allowed herself a small smile, but her mind was already turning toward the future. There was still much work to be done, and she was determined to see it through. Later that afternoon, as Amira reviewed the final details of the investigation, her assistant entered the office with a puzzled expression. "There's something you need to see," he said, handing her a printout. It was an anonymous letter, similar to the one that had first tipped her off about Daniel. But this one was different. It hinted at something deeper, irregularities at a corporate level, decisions made by higher-ups that enabled people like Daniel to act without consequence. Amira felt a chill run down her spine. She had thought the fight was over, but this letter suggested otherwise. As she read the final line, her resolve hardened. The battle for justice wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The air in Crestwood Savings Bank was filled with a mix of quiet murmurs and the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, a typical day in the life of a bustling financial institution. Customers came and went, their expressions ranging from focused to frustrated, as they navigated the humdrum tasks of everyday banking. Amid the chatter and the faint hum of machines, one figure stood out at the central teller station. Daniel Hargrove, with his meticulously styled blonde hair and polished demeanor, carried himself with an air of superiority it was hard to ignore. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room like a predator sizing up its prey. To those who worked with him, his arrogance was both a hallmark and a warning sign. Daniel prided himself on control, over his appearance, over his station, and over the customers who dared approach him. He lived for the little power plays, the small moments where he could assert dominance under the guise of bank policy. He perfected the art of the patronizing smile and the dismissive wave. Most days, his behavior went unchecked, brushed aside as mere personality quirks. But today was different. Today, his actions were about to backfire in a way he could never have anticipated. Amira Bennett entered the bank with an aura that turned heads. Dressed in a tailored navy suit that spoke of quiet authority, she exuded confidence without a hint of arrogance. Her natural curls framed her face elegantly, and the determined click of her heels against the marble floor was a rhythm of purpose. She carried herself with the grace of someone who had fought battles and won, yet her smile, while it came, was warm and genuine. Approaching the counter, Amira slid her account card across the polished surface. "I'd like to access my account, please," she said, her voice calm but resolute. Daniel barely glanced at her before picking up the card. He smirked, flipping it back toward her without bothering to check the system. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his tone dripping with false politeness. "We've been having some issues with accounts like yours. Suspicious activity, you understand." The words hung in the air like a bad odor, and the insinuation behind them was impossible to miss. Amira's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet disbelief. "What sort of issues are you referring to?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with steel. Daniel leaned forward, as if sharing a secret, though his voice was loud enough for others nearby to hear. "Let's just say we have protocols for certain flagged accounts. You'll need to come back another time." A murmur rippled through the room as customers turned to watch the exchange. The tension at the counter was palpable, and Amira straightened her posture, refusing to back down. "I need access to my funds immediately," she said, her tone sharper now. "Not possible," Daniel replied, leaning back with a smug grin. "It's bank policy." The confrontation was unfolding like a slow-motion train wreck, drawing the attention of both staff and customers. When Amira demanded to speak to a manager, Daniel hesitated, the first crack in his facade of confidence. He eventually summoned the assistant manager, a wiry man whose nervous energy only added to the scene's discomfort. But even with his arrival, the situation escalated further, with Daniel's condescension remaining unchecked and Amira's resolve growing stronger. By the time Amira left the bank, the air was thick with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Daniel, in his arrogance, believed he had won. He returned to his station with a smirk, oblivious to the ripple effects of his actions. But the storm brewing beneath the surface was one he couldn't see coming. Later that day, the bank staff were called into an unexpected meeting. Whispers filled the break room as employees speculated about the reason for the sudden assembly. Daniel strolled in with his usual swagger, assuming it was just another mundane briefing. He took a seat near the back, lounging casually as if the world revolved around him. At the head of the room stood a figure that made the air shift. Amira Bennett, now dressed in a crisp white blouse and a sleek black blazer, commanded the room without uttering a word. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and authoritative, cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "Good afternoon," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Amira Bennett, and I am your new regional director." The announcement sent shockwaves through the room. Gasps and exchanged glances rippled among the employees, but none were more stunned than Daniel. His confidence evaporated in an instant, replaced by a look of pale disbelief. Amira's eyes lingered on him for a moment, just long enough to let the weight of the situation sink in. "As I've reviewed operations at this branch," Amira continued, her tone professional but firm, "it's become clear that certain behaviors and attitudes are holding us back. Let me be clear, discrimination and poor customer service have no place here." Daniel's heart sank as her words seemed to pierce through the room, landing squarely on him. For the first time in his career, he was no longer in control. And as Amira paused, letting the tension hum in the air, everyone in the room understood one thing: the days of unchecked arrogance were over. What would come next, however, was something no one, especially Daniel, could have predicted. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside Daniel's head. He struggled to process what was happening. Amira Bennett, the woman he had so casually dismissed just hours earlier, was now standing at the head of the room, delivering a message that felt like a direct attack on his carefully constructed world. How could this have happened? He had built his career on confidence and control, and now, in the blink of an eye, it seemed both were slipping away. Amira's gaze swept across the room again, sharp and discerning. Her posture was relaxed, but her presence was commanding, leaving no doubt that she was in charge. "Before we continue, I want you all to know that my role here isn't just to oversee this branch. It's to ensure that everyone, staff and customers alike, are treated with respect and fairness. That starts today." The words landed heavily, especially on Daniel, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His mind raced as he replayed the earlier interaction in his head, now seeing it through an entirely different lens. He had underestimated her, that much was clear. But what did this mean for him now? Did she plan to call him out in front of everyone? Would she dig into his past actions? Amira continued, her tone steady but firm. Over the coming weeks, I'll be implementing changes aimed at improving our operations and fostering a more inclusive environment. Some of these changes may feel uncomfortable at first, but they're necessary for us to move forward as a team. I trust that each of you will rise to the occasion. Daniel's stomach tightened. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues darting toward him, though none lingered long enough to be caught. Everyone knew his reputation. He had made it clear through countless interactions that he saw himself as untouchable. But now, for the first time, the cracks in his armor were visible, and it was impossible to ignore. As the meeting continued, Amira outlined her plans for the branch. She spoke with a calm authority, never raising her voice but making it clear that she meant business. There would be mandatory training sessions on diversity and inclusion, regular performance reviews, and new policies to ensure accountability at all levels. She also invited employees to provide anonymous feedback, encouraging them to voice any concerns or suggestions without fear of retaliation. The latter point hit Daniel like a sucker punch. He had always thrived in an environment where power dynamics were clear, where people knew their place and didn't dare question his authority. But now, the very structure that had protected him was being dismantled piece by piece, and he had no idea how to navigate this new reality. When the meeting finally ended, the room erupted into quiet murmurs as employees filed out. Some looked energized by Amira's vision, while others seemed apprehensive, unsure of what these changes would mean for them. Daniel lingered, hoping to avoid catching Amira's attention. But just as he was about to slip out the door, her voice stopped him in his tracks. "Mr. Hargrove, a moment of your time." He froze, his pulse quickening. Turning slowly, he forced a tight smile. "Of course," he said, his voice betraying none of the panic he felt inside. Amira gestured toward her office, and he followed her, feeling the weight of his colleague's eyes on his back as he went. The walk felt like a mile, though it was only a few steps. Once inside, Amira closed the door and motioned for him to sit. She took her seat across from him, folding her hands neatly on the desk. "I won't take up too much of your time," she began, her tone polite but firm. "I just wanted to address what happened earlier today." Daniel's mouth went dry. He opened it to respond, but Amira held up her hands, stopping him. "Let me finish," she said. "I've reviewed the incident, and I must say I'm disappointed. Your behavior toward me as a customer was not only unprofessional, but also deeply concerning." Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing for an excuse, a justification, anything to diffuse the situation. "Miss Bennett, I assure you there was no malice intended. I was simply following protocol." "Protocol," Amira interrupted, her tone sharper now, "does not excuse prejudice or poor customer service. What you displayed today was not just a lapse in judgment. It was a failure to uphold the standards this institution should represent." Her words cut through him like a blade. For a moment, he considered pushing back, defending himself. But the look in her eyes told him it would be a futile effort. This was not a woman who tolerated excuses. "I want to make something very clear," Amira continued. "I believe in second chances, but I also believe in accountability. Consider this your warning, Mr. Hargrove. Any further behavior of this nature will not be tolerated. Is that understood?" Daniel nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched. "Understood," he managed to say. "Good." Amira stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "You're dismissed." As he left her office, Daniel felt a mix of anger, humiliation, and something else he couldn't quite name. Fear, perhaps. For the first time in his career, he was facing the possibility that his actions might have real consequences. And the worst part was, he knew Amira wasn't bluffing. Back at his station, Daniel tried to focus on his work, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of Amira standing at the head of the room, commanding respect with every word. She was everything he had pretended to be: strong, confident, and unquestionably in control. And now, she was his boss. Meanwhile, Amira returned to her desk, feeling a sense of satisfaction tempered by the weight of the task ahead. She knew Daniel's behavior was just the tip of the iceberg. The culture at this branch needed a complete overhaul, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But she was ready for the challenge. This wasn't just about correcting one man's arrogance. It was about creating a space where everyone, from employees to customers, felt valued and respected. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the bank, a sense of quiet anticipation hung in the air. The day's events had set the stage for a reckoning, one that would test everyone involved. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: the balance of power had shifted, and nothing would ever be the same again. As the days unfolded, the atmosphere at Crestwood Savings Bank grew thick with unease. The employees tread carefully, wary of Amira's presence and the changes she had begun to implement. Meetings that once felt routine were now infused with purpose, each one reinforcing her commitment to transparency and equality. Amira's leadership style was unlike anything the staff had experienced before. She listened, asked pointed questions, and held everyone to the same high standard, no exceptions. For some, her approach was inspiring. For others, like Daniel Hargrove, it was suffocating. Daniel sat at his desk, his mind clouded with frustration. The warning Amira had given him echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of how his power had been stripped away. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that was deeply uncomfortable. It wasn't just about the incident with Amira anymore. Her presence seemed to magnify every flaw he had tried to hide. Each new policy, each mandatory training session, felt like a spotlight on his shortcomings. One morning, as Daniel scrolled through his inbox, he found an email with the subject line: *** mandatory bias awareness training. Attendance required. ***, he scoffed, leaning back in his chair. To him, the training felt like a punishment, a way for Amira to make an example out of him. But deep down, a part of him couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. If he didn't adapt, his future at the bank might be in jeopardy. Across the office, other employees were grappling with their own reactions to the changes. Sophie, a young teller who had always admired Daniel's confidence, found herself questioning her loyalty. She had witnessed his behavior toward Amira that day and couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an isolated incident. As she participated in the new training sessions, Sophie began to see things in a different light. The stories shared during the sessions, accounts of subtle biases and overt discrimination, were eye-opening. For the first time, she wondered if she had been complicit by staying silent. Meanwhile, Amira worked tirelessly behind the scenes, reviewing reports, observing interactions, and meeting with employees one-on-one. She knew that changing a workplace culture was like steering a massive ship. It required patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to the destination. But she also knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed allies, people who believed in her vision and were willing to help make it a reality. One such ally emerged in the form of Marcus, a senior loan officer who had been with the bank for over a decade. Marcus was respected by his peers for his professionalism and integrity, and he had seen firsthand how the old ways of doing things had held the branch back. When Amira approached him to discuss her plans, he listened intently, nodding in agreement as she laid out her goals. "You have my full support," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But you should know, not everyone is going to be on board. There are people here who thrive on the status quo. They're not going to give up their power without a fight." Amira smiled faintly, her resolve unshaken. "I'm not here to make friends, Marcus. I'm here to make a difference. If that means ruffling a few feathers, so be it." While Amira focused on building bridges, Daniel was busy trying to protect what little ground he had left. He began to gather allies of his own, colleagues who shared his disdain for the new policies. In hushed conversations during lunch breaks and after hours, they vented their frustrations and plotted ways to resist the changes. To Daniel, it felt like a battle for survival, a last stand against what he saw as an unnecessary upheaval. But what Daniel didn't realize was that the changes weren't just coming from the top down. They were taking root among the employees, growing quietly but steadily. People who had once accepted the status quo were beginning to question it. They spoke up during meetings, shared their perspectives during training sessions, and started holding each other accountable. The culture of complacency that had defined the branch for so long was beginning to crumble. One afternoon, during a particularly tense team meeting, Amira announced a new initiative, an anonymous feedback system where employees could report concerns or suggest improvements. The idea was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as an opportunity to voice their opinions without fear of retaliation. Others, like Daniel, viewed it as a tool for micromanagement. As the meeting ended, Daniel approached Sophie, his voice low and conspiratorial. "You really think this feedback thing is a good idea? It's just another way for her to control us." Sophie hesitated, her loyalty to Daniel wavering. "I don't know," she said finally. "Maybe it's a chance to fix things that have been wrong for a long time." Daniel frowned, sensing the shift in her tone. "Fix things," he repeated. "What's wrong with the way we've been doing things?" Sophie didn't answer. Instead, she walked away, leaving Daniel standing alone, his frustration boiling over. For the first time, he felt the sting of isolation, the realization that his influence was slipping away. As the weeks passed, the tension in the branch reached a boiling point. The feedback system began to uncover patterns of bias and misconduct, shining a light on behavior that had long gone unchecked. Many of the reports pointed back to Daniel, painting a picture of a man whose arrogance and prejudice had alienated both colleagues and customers. Amira reviewed the reports carefully, her expression unreadable. She knew that confronting Daniel directly would be a delicate matter. She couldn't afford to appear vengeful or heavy-handed. Her goal wasn't just to hold him accountable. It was to send a message to everyone in the branch that the old ways of doing things were over. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Amira sat in her office, the reports spread out before her. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, that the conflicts within the branch were far from resolved. But she also knew that change was never easy. It was messy, uncomfortable, and often met with resistance. Yet, as she looked out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance, she felt a deep sense of purpose. This was more than just a job, it was a mission. And while the battle was far from over, Amira was ready to face whatever came next. The bank felt different now, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. Every interaction seemed to carry a double meaning, every glance another reminder that things were changing. For some, the change was welcome, a breath of fresh air in a stale environment. For others, like Daniel, it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, and he was losing his footing.